So, on to our keynote speaker, who today is Dr. Joanna Poole. And she is a ST7 anaesthetist in the 7 deanery, with sub-interests in trauma, intensive care, and mitochondria. Her physiology interests have led her to have involvement with the Mayo Clinic, the Association of Anaesthetists, the Big Sick, and World Extreme Medicine Conference. Presentations in the last few years, so very busy. After moving between Manchester and Bristol deaneries as an ST3, she's experienced a moral injury leading to burnout and PTS. She's published a Little Read blog, which exploded on social media. And that led to some very wonderful experiences and connections that have saved a career in medicine. When NASA had been beckoning, I'm very pleased to welcome Joanna here today.
Right. Hello, everyone. I'm Jo. I'm ST7, but I'm currently doing 12 months of acute medicine because I didn't want to dual train earlier on because I wanted to quit, so I'm now having to make my life much more difficult. So this is kind of a story about how a really bad day at work ended up in the health secretary's office, and I now have a pen pal who is an astronaut. So, I'm Jo. I work in Gloucester now. I'm ST7 doing 12 months of acute medicine. So whenever I approach a problem, I approach it how I have my finals revision notes, so define it, the epidemiology, the investigations, the management. I'm not really into, it really works, there's lots of evidence, but I'm not a yoga, really well-being person. I'm highly scientific, and this is how I approach everything in life. So I was going to talk about the evolution of morality, space, obviously, the Battle of Marathon, what the military do, and what the Romans did when they had sort of morally injured people. So this is the definition, this is in the Lancet. What you essentially need to know is that it's an actual pathology where something that you hold very deeply has been completely violated, and it affects your very deep hindbrain and decision-making structures, where you essentially mistrust everyone in the world around you. So it affects your human relationships, your performance. It's linked to post-traumatic stress and burnout, but it's a separate part of the spectrum. And when they first offered me to come and talk, I was a bit like, oh, I don't really like talking. And I wasn't sure about moral injury as a topic. They said you could have a topic of your choice. So I was like, oh, I could talk about organelle evolution in primitive Earth, which is much more me. But as soon as I looked into the numbers about burnout and the waves of people leaving and moral injury, it's so staggering, I just had to talk about it. So excuse me for reading off there, I don't have it down there. I'm going to talk about number 2 first. So this was a survey by the BMA, sort of investigating moral injury in medics and how it was going to affect their life. So 60% they were going to work fewer hours, a quarter were going to move to another country, a fifth were just going to locum. This is across all grades. Early retirement was 50%, career break 40%. These are numbers that the NHS cannot afford. So what contributed? It was insufficient staff, mental fatigue, and lack of time, and you can't provide timely treatment. So I can see it because I'm on acute medicine. We've given up on 4-hour breaches, we've given up on 12-hour breaches. People are dying before even seeing a consultant. It's horrific, it's disaster medicine. And I know everyone likes to kind of play the generation gap thing, but when you look at moral injury, the numbers are completely similar between consultants and juniors. I'm not doing very well technologically, right? Yes, bodes well for AI, doesn't it? Right. The specialties that have the highest rates of this are the ones you'd expect: ED, ICU, and it's 90%. A lot of these figures come from just post-COVID, so obviously they're worse than usual. And this was something else, because a lot of the criticism you get when you say that you're unhappy in medicine comes from, you're not resilient enough, you're a different generation, you weren't taught to be challenged. But people have been saying this, so this is the ancient Greeks. They all thought the next generation were rubbish as well. In 1843, they thought the morals of children are tenfold worse than formerly. And everyone now thinks we're struggling because we buy avocados and toast. So I just wanted to point out that we're quite amnesic about our own development, and I would not have the same reactions now that I did back then because I've just got life experience. And sometimes we assign that to the generation difference. This is how neuronal networks work, and I also think we have a lot of prejudices, both from juniors to seniors, and the way back down and different specialties, etc. And this is actually how AI works. So you have your prior beliefs, you're presented with evidence, and you still don't quite believe it, but you do shunt that way. So I'm just trying to shunt everyone a bit that way, towards the evidence. So people connect well with human stories. So this is my family up there. My brother's a HEMS paramedic, dad's a computer and aeronautical engineer, mum's a midwife. They came from really poor backgrounds. So my mum's neighbour used to have to buy her school uniform, single-parent household in Blackpool. Dad was also from a really hard-working, working-class family, but his dad died in his teens and he had to sort of provide for the family. But he was the recipient of a labour apprenticeship type university thing. He's super clever, a little bit autistic, and if I tell you that there was a child on the news who was 3 who had got into Mensa for being able to speak, I think, 7 languages to count to 100, and my dad was like, well, it's not 1,000, is it? So that was my upbringing. But he told me when I was about 6 that I needed to get into Oxbridge, so I was like, right, okay, Dad, got that. Worked really hard all my life, and I have a very different life now to my cousins. So 1 runs county lines, 2 are dead by the age of 35. But I assign that to education, so that's another big thing for me. But to talk about my moral injury, it's probably taken me quite a long time to be able to talk about this at all, let alone to a room full of people. But I was on ITU as an ST3, I'd just moved, my horse had died, my brother was ill, my aunt had just gone to ITU, and you're working like those crazy 3 12-hour, then 4 12-hour shifts with a commute, so you're sleeping in like the service stations. So you're just tired and don't really have the resilience to deal with it. I'd seen a lot of trauma and accidents. I'm usually a very calm person. This really bothered me. So it was about 2 a.m. I'd come back from an arrest outside in the hospital, carrying, you know, the big bag of equipment. I walk into ITU, a consultant comes out of one of the side rooms and keels down on the floor and was in like the fetal position crying. So my colleague dealt with her, and straight behind her came the mother of a teenage adolescent. I don't want to reveal too much information to a personal identification. But essentially this adolescent between 14 and 16 had been hit by a car on his motorbike and had his skull completely crushed. They'd taken him to neurotheatre to put a pressure bolt in, you know, release the pressure, but the intracranial pressure was 100 and his blood pressure was 70, and that was with the roof off. So he was completely catastrophically injured, and it was very gory, and he was having the most awful seizures, and his mum and brother were in the room. So he was being palliated. There was no question that this was salvageable, but we couldn't stop him seizing. And I say we, it was just me, because everyone had sort of disappeared. And it was gory because you can imagine seizing with open catastrophic head injuries is a bit ugly. And his mum and his younger brother were there. And I was just trying to shield them from view and suction everything out of the problem. When I rang the ITU consultant, they weren't familiar with the situation because they weren't there, they didn't know anything about it, so they didn't really feel comfortable giving me advice on stopping the seizures. He was on everything, you know, thiopentone, propofol, he'd had Keppra, he'd had everything, but I think his intracranial pressure was just so high, no drugs could penetrate the CNS because his blood pressure was 70. So the only options I really had were muscle relaxant and propofol, and muscle relaxant would feel too much like euthanasia. I know it's a split difference. Anyway, long story short, I then called the neuro and anaesthetic consultant who just said, I'm so sorry, I just cannot function. I am so upset by this case. She'd had to listen to the dad saying goodbye to the child on the phone because the dad was in Scotland. And I caught up with her since, and you know, she also said this was one of the worst cases of her career. So when someone said I should do GP because I was upset by this, I was a bit cross. Anyway, really intrusive memories, really horrible. For a long time, I really felt like I'd killed this boy by giving him too much propofol to stop him seizing. There's so much I do differently now, but anyway, it really bothered me. Went on, still quite stressed, still quite busy. You start at a new trust, you start on nights, you don't have an ID badge, you can't get into the blood fridge. It was just one of those things that I think we're getting better at now. Anyway, I worked my socks off. I had like a lady who had platelets of 4. Her spinal that I hadn't done had worn off because they were 2 hours into the horrible C-section, major hemorrhage, and then couldn't intubate her, so someone had to like run up the hill to help me. It was just one of those awful cases, went on for hours. She was an IVDU, so she had horrible pain afterwards, so I did blocks, I did ketamine. I just felt I'd used every ounce of my training, and I walk out and I have a penalty charge notice for parking. And I was like, you know what, I'm done, I just quit, I'm just sick of this now. And my family, who had, put heart and soul into getting me through medicine, and at one point we only had £5 a month left over to get me through the London things, they were like, why are you doing this? This is stupid. And that's my family, who are ridiculous. So what happened after that? I'm not very good at talking about my feelings, so no one at work really knew how I felt, but I was totally done. And I wrote my own blog, which I'd had for 10 years, left over from editing a science magazine. And I used to write on there about human evolution and mitochondria and all these geeky things, but I'd written my feelings. And sod's law, 2 people had read that blog in about 10 years, and essentially it just went a bit viral. I got so many stories from other medics, like really awful stories. My partner hung himself and I was told to come to work and take one for the team. I had a miscarriage of my twins, which was my 5th set of IVF, and I was told it happens to 1 in 5 women, and I had to finish the operation. These kind of really harrowing things, which when you're already quite burnt out and a bit fed up with the system, I'd had enough. And then, because there were so many, I wanted to go to an overriding body and say, look, everyone's really unhappy, what can we do about this? So we had a Facebook page for the junior doctor strikes back in when Jeremy Hunt was the thing, but there were lots of journalists on there. So anyway, this blog, which I'd written in a lot of anger, went and ended up on page 5 of The Guardian. Turns out the Department of Health scan newspapers, and if you've got, front pages with health stuff on, they ring that trust, and the CEO gets in trouble. And I had a message from Matt Hancock on Twitter, which was a bit surreal. But what did help is both people at work were really encouraging. There were the usual criticism that you're going to get, but when you feel like I felt, it didn't really matter what people thought of you. I've been a really good girl all my life, and I was just like, no, I'm fed up now, and I don't want parking tickets for going to work. And but it led to some really interesting opportunities. So Charlotte Summers in Cambridge, she's a powerhouse. She's really clever, really nice. Took me to labs. She arranged for me to start working up to a PhD. So this was my big thing that I was going to do before I had the baby, which is circadian epigenetics. So interesting fact, 9 o'clock in the morning, IL-1, TNF-alpha, 6, really high. It reaches a zenith later in the day. And if you get infected at a certain time of day, you have a better outcome than other things, clinically significant. It's a very interesting area. This is my baby, he's really cute. And then he's 7 months now. And then this really cool GP, he's a basics GP, but he's also Princess Anne's GP. He does loads of horse stuff, and I love horses, so he took me to go and play on a quad bike and do badminton and Blenheim, and so I do that now for fun. Because a lot of people said to me, you guys all think medicine is the NHS, and of course it's not. Medicine's an amazing career, loads of opportunities. And then I did this talk, and I met 2 astronauts. And now we talk, and they're just, so I've been given all these opportunities, and I also have to point out, when I went to the college with this, I thought they would be go away. They were really helpful. I was really frightened of all the media stuff, and they were like, we'll give you media training, we'll teach you how to talk to the press. The Academy of Royal Colleges were like, we'll fight for you, we will, if you get in trouble for whistleblowing, we will, put out a statement. And I just can't say enough, I was shocked. And that kind of restored some of the moral injury I received, I think. So talking a bit about ancient civilizations, how they manage this sort of thing. Returning Roman warriors came to see the Vestal Virgins for some blessings. The Romans knew that the night before a big battle, there would be mass hysteria. And so they trained their generals to kind of, morally sort of encourage their warriors. And that was the Romans. They were very sophisticated, took over a lot of the planet. The Native Americans, when you come back from battle, you're polluted, so they take you and put you in sort of a steam room to sweat it out. These were the Assyrians. They weren't very nice, and I can't remember why I've put that there. The Battle of Marathon was a really interesting thing. So this was where the Greeks won at overwhelming odds, and it's immortalized in the Pantheon panels. And what's really interesting, there was this lowly foot soldier who saw his friend be beheaded right next to him, and it describes very early precedent for PTSD in soldiers in that hand-to-hand combat, and he was struck blind. So you get these strange functional neurological disorders, we don't really understand it, but there's this record of him losing his sight when he's so traumatized by seeing his friend be killed. And when he returns, he is treated as a hero. His society think he is so cool. The gods have actually removed his sight to bless him because he saw something so awful. And I don't think we treat any of our warriors in this way, both in the military, to be honest, and in medicine. I don't know, my experience a little bit was a bit, suck it up, this is what happens, and go and do GP because anaesthetics is stressful. So I did advanced trauma, and I want to do intensive care. And this is how I understood it at the time, because I have to science things out. So moral injury has been obviously spread a lot from the army, from people who have had to torture people or accidentally blow up children and then have to go and reintegrate. But it shows that when they put them in a functional MRI scanner, you have really deep changes to the deep functional network, where you completely interpret everything very differently after being morally injured. It's different to just being a bit upset by something. It shortens your telomeres. Broca's area for expression, if you've been traumatized at all, you actually get inhibition of Broca's area. You can't talk about it. I thought that was bizarre and quite interesting. If you take medical students before an exam when they're really stressed and you vaccinate them, they get much lower antibody titers than if you do it after the exam. So the brain-body thing is very real. It's all about cortisol, catecholamines. If you take the hippocampus and expose all those neurons to cortisol, the dendrites disappear. So your working memory is trashed, whether it's burnout, whether it's PTS, whether it's any of these things. And that's really bad for patient safety. And one of the things the deanery psychologist said to me when I went to see them was how much they're realizing that working memory and cognitive performance is completely obliterated by these things. And it was quite concerning to them that we were still working with these conditions. So this is actually really amazing. I must thank a nurse who sent me this. So I asked for some other examples of moral injury or PTS in people from any background, and this is a nurse from the COVID pandemic, and she actually cried that the Royal College of Anaesthetists were talking about moral injury. She just thought that was beyond amazing that someone was recognising this and sort of looking after people. I'll leave people to read it and I'm sorry that it's sort of gone out of alignment, but this was from notes and notes and notes from all her therapy sessions, so it was very powerful. I'll just give people about 10 seconds, finish reading that. Anyone need more time? Okay. What was this? So this was a review in Psychiatry 2022 post-COVID, what contributed to PTS in COVID staff, the risk of catching it, that some people couldn't work on the front lines because they were immunosuppressed, you couldn't provide the right care, you didn't have enough ventilators, you didn't have enough resources. It's probably the first time in my career, you're trained to the gold standard evidence. This is 0.2% more effective than something else, P equals 0.05. But what do you do when you don't have that equipment available? We were never trained for that. It's not a disaster medicine thing, except it's becoming that now. So we're going to see this more and more. People didn't feel they were supported, we weren't supported by the government, etc., etc. There were actually over 100,000 healthcare workers killed by COVID, and the rates of PTSD in nurses and physicians is 20%. And if you had any other condition that was 20% prevalence in the working population, we would all be talking about it. So how do you get people out of this thing? Leadership. So for me, it was being taken to labs, being given all these opportunities, taken to Blenheim. I met Princess Anne next to a toilet because somebody had collapsed and her bodyguards came over to give me a hand, and then she was just stood there. All these bizarre experiences. Simon Sidek is a guy who looks at the Navy SEALs, and he basically showed that what you have is at one axis you have trustworthiness, and on the other axis you have performance. So performance is, I would trust you with my life, and trustworthiness is, I would trust you with my wife, or equivalent. And he basically showed that the top performing Navy SEALs, so the creme de la creme of the Navy SEALs, will always pick trustworthiness in a leader over performance. They'd rather have both, but they want trustworthiness because it elevates the whole team. And I don't know that we have this right in all leadership areas. It's usually a performance thing. Anyway. I will leave that, that's diplomatic. You need structures in place to help people that are suffering. So I had the Deanery Support Unit, who were amazing. I honestly can't, they were incredible. They paid for what would have been really expensive. I think I got 3 sessions of CBT to deal with the PTS and intrusive memories and lack of sleep and dissociation before COVID hit. But I was so calm about a world pandemic because the therapy was just so good. I was like, bring it on, it's fine. Totally unbothered by COVID. This is what the BMA survey said when they asked staff what would fix the problem for you. So they said more staff, can't really do much about that. Streamline bureaucracy. So if I had to pick one thing that made me burn out, it was not being given an ID badge on time. It was constantly those 3-month rotations on like lack of sleep when you don't know people, not having an induction booklet, not knowing where the blood fridge is. They're all things that actually should be there but somehow aren't. And always getting emergency tax when you rotate, I cannot tell you how annoying that is. Like, you know, I've had to take out loans lower down to pay off the mortgage because of the emergency tax situation, and it's completely avoidable. I think we should all have a lead employer. What else did they say? And a greater emphasis on the work culture and sharing feelings and concerns. And I think post-COVID, this has really come through, and that's probably why you're having a lecture on this topic at a college conference. I don't think this would have happened 10 years ago, and that's amazing leadership. And I think all of us, I hope people know who these are. So Aragorn was always my like teenage crush, but he's just the ultimate leader, Men of Gondor. And Game of Thrones is obviously Cersei, the Lannisters, a bit evil, but we all know who we'd want to work for. And you know, both are effective in their own way, but we've definitely met both in our careers. What managers need to know, you need to sort out the bureaucracy. The pay and the rota is just, if you want to stop people from going to Australia, you just have to sort that out. It only takes 1 or 2 emergency taxes for you just to be fuming. So that needs sorting. There's still a lot of judgment, and it's a lot of these things, post-traumatic stress, moral injury, they're shame-based pathology. So if you judge people and say, well, how are you going to be a consultant if you've got this? You're just going to make them feel worse. It doesn't help. So if you can't say something nice, just don't say it. Facilitated ethical discussions. When people were talking about how we were going to pick who to ventilate, because at one point the question was, are we going to ventilate anyone over the age of 40? You know, how are we going to reconcile that with our, you know, drive to help people? And they were actually saying we need to get clinical ethicists involved in every hospital. We're going to have like ethical committees. And I suppose you already have it probably for the organ transplants and everything else. Psychotherapy is obviously specialist input, and it's, I've seen a real change in the last 6 to 12 months. There is actually now funding available for psychologists on ITU, for example, and I know the nurses there use it really heavily. Do you know what, I'm going to skip through this, wasn't that interesting? So, babies as young as 3 months will already prefer puppets that are very nice and friendly to them than slightly threatening. At 12 months, kids are able, if you give one 6 cookies and the other one 3, they'll be quite upset. They just innately know that's really unfair. So a lot of this is talking about the evolution of morality. It's already there in us when we are children. These are bonobos. They're halfway between chimps and humans in terms of empathy. And empathy, they think, is a prerequisite for morality. And I think that gets burnt out of us a little bit. And what I was saying with that is that, yeah, I can't remember what I was going to say about that. And this was really interesting. So when I looked back at the foundation of the NHS, I went and read pages and pages and pages and pages of documents from like 1948 when it was set up. And you would never do it now. And they were so burnt out after the war. They had like no resources. They had no money. Half the medics were like, I don't want to do this anymore. A lot of others were like, you know what, you're going to have to pay us a huge amount of money if you want us to carry on doing this. Rings bells. And but somehow they pulled it up out of the ashes and they created this national system of free healthcare. So it's been done before, so I think we can look after it. But a lot of the quotes that they included in those reports, and it's really interesting. I'll see if I can find the link. I'll put it on my Twitter. They said that there was this guy. They were like, you know what, he was a really, really, really good GP. Amazing. I'd have him as my doctor. But he used to whip the children out of his way as he rode off to his clinic. And I still think we have people like that, particularly in orthopedic surgery, I would say. But yeah, there's a quote that I will probably mutilate, but it's saying how, you know, as time goes by, things don't really change. And I don't know about other people, and I can see it in acute medicine. It's really broken right now. And I think part of us are like, you know what, we just need to give up and have a new system. It's not working. But I think it's so important that it does. And I took this quote, which I, will read out. So the state has seen in the profession a body insistent upon the privacy and individuality of its work, the sanctity of its traditions, and the freedom of its engagement. The profession has seen in the States an organisation apparently devoted to the infringement of these traditions, incapable of putting anything worthy in their place. It is suspicious and mistrustful of what it considers to be unnecessary intervention. It has feared the imposition of some cast iron system which might in practice make the practitioner of medicine servile, dependent and fettered. And I think if you talk to trainees right now, that is exactly how they feel, and it's going to take leadership to step up and take the NHS back for ourselves. And I cannot thank the amazing people we have in our profession enough, because I was totally just like, I'm going to go and work for NASA, and people just taking a day out of their lives to take me around was what saved me, and I promised I would pay it forward, which is why you are having this presentation and not one about mitochondria. Thank you.